Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. I am going to have the difficult responsibility today to sit in for the chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Lowenthal, and my apologies to the ranking member and to others for the fact that it won't be as smooth as he runs his meetings. So thank you, and we're meeting today to hear testimony on the legislation HR 7580, the Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, show order. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. And without objection, Representatives Moore, Carl, and Fulcher are authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. As described in the notice, the statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at HNRC docs at mail.house.gov. Members physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our fully in-person meeting, members are muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent noises. Finally, members or witnesses experience technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. And with that, let me begin with my opening statement. This week marks the 150th anniversary of the mining law of 1872. Usually anniversaries are something to celebrate, but in this case, it's a stark reminder that the time for change is long, long overdue. The mining industry has seized the antiquity of this mining law as an opportunity to appropriate public lands, environment, indigenous communities, and public health without any semblance of accountability. This is an industry that appears to think that America's public lands are its birthright, and they should be able to pick and choose where they get to dig and what they get to spoil, all without paying a cent of royalties. It's all backwards. America's public lands belong to all Americans, not the mining industry. That's why legislation has been introduced to overhaul the mining law of 1872, and that's why I think it's as important as ever to put this into law. The Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act will improve the way we do mining in several fundamental ways. First, the bill puts a royalty in place for all minerals extracted from public lands. Under the current law, mining companies don't pay a single cent to use and to appropriate from our public lands. Not even big oil has a deal that's slanted that much toward its industry. Second, the bill protects special places and brings mining under the land use planning process. When we talk about threats to the Grand Canyon or the boundary waters or indigenous sacred sites like Oak Flats or Bears Ear, it all comes back to the fundamental flaw in the mining law that tilts the balance of power away from land managers acting on behalf of the American people and towards the mining industry's corporate interest and profit line. My bill gives power back to land managers and sets benchmarks, environmental standards for permitting and reclamation. Third, the legislation protects tribal sovereignty and requires minimal tribal consultation. For too long, tribes have been overlooked when it comes to land management, and mining is no exception. This bill ensures that federal agencies hear directly from tribes that are impacted by mining projects and mining development. And finally, the bill finishes the work of the bipartisan infrastructure law by providing a dedicated source of funding for abandoned hard rock mine cleanup. While the law moved us in the right direction, hard rock mining cleanup didn't get the funding. My bill makes sure that industry, not taxpayer, foots the bill for this toxic legacy of pollution. There's a lot of interest in Congress and the administration right now about critical minerals, especially minerals that are important for renewable energy and our clean energy transition. We shouldn't sacrifice tribal sacred sites, wilderness, national forests, public health, just because the metals coming from the ground will go into a wind turbine or a solar panel on an electric vehicle battery. I think the administration gets it. We all want to see mining done under the best possible labor and environmental standards, but that isn't possible without a comprehensive rewrite of the mining law. I hope that today's hearing makes it clear why this legislation is so necessary, but also highlights the places where we all might agree. I look forward to hearing from the Biden administration and our invited witnesses on the legislation, and I want to thank them all for being here and for taking the time. With that, let me recognize Representative Carroll, who is sitting in for Ranking Member Stauber today. We're both designees per se today. Ms. Carroll, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I actually appreciate the opportunity to be here in person with you and take fill the large shoes of Congressman Stauber. But I want to thank the witnesses for being here in person and virtually as well. And Mr. Chairman, you have heard me and my colleagues discuss hard rock mining many times this Congress. But as you know, the issues go back many years. Concern about the rising demand for minerals, the global dominance of China, and the pending supply chain crisis predates my time in this committee. Now, the truth is undeniable. Demand for copper, lithium, cobalt, and dozens of other minerals is rapidly outpacing supply. This is largely due to the projected growth of the renewable energy as electric vehicles, battery storage, and wind and solar power cannot be built without these rare and valuable resources. The aggressive renewable goals set by the Biden administration and other governments are exacerbating the coming shortage. We cannot recycle our way out of this problem. The International Energy Agency predicts demand for critical minerals could increase by 6 times by 2040. The question is not do we need more mining, but rather where and how should we do it? Unfortunately, the bill we are considering today, H.R. 7580, ignores these ever-worsening supply chain concerns. H.R. 7580 is framed as a reform of the mining law of 1872 for renewable energy minerals. In reality, this bill would permanently harm our domestic mining sector and cripple our access to minerals for renewable energy or any other purpose. I have been pleased to see the Biden administration acknowledge the link between mining and renewables, but unfortunately, much of what the Biden administration says directly conflicts with what it does. For instance, President Biden hosted a roundtable in February to discuss the importance of responsible domestic mining. The administration even issued a statement saying global demand for these critical minerals is set to skyrocket by 400 to 600%. Citing the importance of expanding domestic mining production, processing, and recycling of critical minerals and material. At the same time, we have seen the Department of the Interior cancel decades-long mineral leases in my friend Congressman Stauber's district, endangering one of the most promising copper, nickel, cobalt projects in the world. The Department of Ag is trying to withdraw that entire area in northern Minnesota from mineral development without even letting the Nepa process take place. The administration and congressional Democrats continue to fight the Resolution Copper project in Arizona despite a federal land exchange and many years of environmental review and tribal consultation. Additionally, a proposed critical habitat designation for Teams buckwheat now threatens a lithium mine in Nevada. Even though worldwide demand for lithium will double by 2025, and examples go on and on, we need to decide what policy choices are in the best interest of our country. The U.S. is hands down one of the best places to mine due to the richness of our resources, our skilled workforce, and our world-class environmental and labor standards. H.R. 7580 would unquestionably take us further away from our technological goals and destroy any chance at competitiveness on the world stage. At a time of increasing international instability and the threat of China looming ever closer, legislation like this is more harmful than ever. And to be submitted to the record, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit Ranking Member Stauber's statement for the record, and also.
Objection?
Okay, and also letters of opposition to H.R. 7080 7580, and statement policies from Eureka County Board of Commission, Elko County Board of Commission, Humboldt County Board of Commission, Pershing County Board of Commission, Western Governors Association, Coeur Mining, American Exploration and Mining Association, National Mining Association, Arizona Mining Association, and Arizona Chamber of Commerce.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. Steve, it's great to see you in the hearing room again, and you will be recognized for 5 minutes for your statement, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair Grijalva, Ranking Member Harrell, members of the subcommittee, my name is Steve Felgus. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management at the Department of the Interior. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the need to reform the General Mining Law of 1872 and Chair Grijalva's legislation, the Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act of 2022. Exactly 150 years and 2 days ago, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the General Mining Law of 1872. Much like the Homestead Act that was signed 10 years earlier, the mining law was designed to encourage the settlement of the American West by giving away public lands and resources at little to no cost. The law allowed citizens to freely explore public lands for valuable minerals such as gold, silver, and copper, to stake a claim if minerals were discovered, and to patent that claim, gaining legal title to the land and all the minerals contained within it for as little as $2.50 an acre. The Mining Law of 1872 did not, however, account for the legacy of environmental degradation that mining would have on its surrounding communities, nor did it provide for royalties or a comprehensive system to evaluate, permit, develop, and reclaim mines to ensure sustainable mining and healthy public lands. Over the last 150 years, the management of our public lands has evolved to meet the needs of our nation, with the Department of the Interior serving as a steward of our public lands and resources for future generations. Many of our laws have changed with the times. The Homestead Act was repealed, but the Mining Law of 1872 remains. To be sure, Congress has updated the laws governing minerals such as oil and gas, coal, and sand and gravel, many of which were originally covered by the Mining Law of 1872, but it has not done so for some of our most valuable and critical hard rock minerals, and in particular the minerals that are so important for a clean energy transition. We can recognize the historic contribution that mining has played in this country, but we must also acknowledge the limits that exist today from relying on such an antiquated law. The Biden-Harris administration recognizes the important role mining will continue to play in the modern economy and the growing need for responsibly sourced critical minerals to realize a clean energy economy, combat climate change, and ensure the security of our nation. These are 21st century imperatives, and they will be difficult to achieve by relying on a relic of the 19th century, designed during the Grant administration for a United States with different needs, different priorities, and different challenges. This is why President Biden has outlined a whole-of-government approach to ensure domestic mining is sustainable, responsible, and efficient. This includes signing Executive Order 14017, which directed an assessment of the supply chains for critical and strategic minerals essential to the economic and national security of the United States. And the President also recently announced his intention to use the Defense Production Act to support the responsible production of 5 critical minerals needed for large-capacity batteries, which will help accelerate the clean energy transition in the short term. The supply chain reviews also made it clear that the mining law must be reformed. In response, the Department of the Interior formed an interagency working group tasked with reviewing existing mining laws, regulations, and permitting processes to make recommendations on what reforms are needed. 2 days ago, on the 150th anniversary of the mining law, that working group hosted a meeting that brought together the mining industry, tribes, states, environmental organizations, and others to discuss the fact that everyone has something to gain from reform of the mining law. Tribes, taxpayers, mining companies, mining communities, everyone. This is just the start of an extensive series of public input and comment sessions to ensure an inclusive process, because the purpose of the working group is to listen to all of these voices and learn, and try to figure out how we can find the common ground where everyone benefits. This working group is being guided by the administration's fundamental principles for domestic mining reform, which list the key values that will drive the efforts to update the country's mining regulations, laws, and permitting processes. These principles would ensure that new production meets strong environmental, community, and tribal consultation standards during all stages of mine development, while improving the efficiency and outcomes of the permitting process. These reforms would ensure that taxpayers, for the first time ever, receive fair return for the extraction of valuable metals from public lands and give the American public confidence that the minerals and materials used in our electric vehicles, smartphones, solar panels, and other technologies are sourced under responsible social, environmental, and labor standards. Many of these principles are embodied in H.R. 7580, the Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act, and we commend Chair Grijalva and his co-sponsors for their work on this landmark piece of legislation. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today. We look forward to working with Congress, states, tribes, the industry, and the general public to gather ideas and forge a new path forward. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Very much, Dr. Felgus, and let me remind members that that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognizes members for any questions they may wish to ask our first panel, and let me now, Ms. Harold, if you're recognized, if you have questions.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for your statement. And I do have a couple of questions, and hopefully we can kind of get through these. I have 2 or 3. Do you know, did the U.S. Geological Survey find that the import reliance of the United States on other countries for minerals grew from 2021 in the report to 2022?
I don't have the USGS report in front of me, but we can get that data and get that back to you.
Okay, I just was curious if it was in there, and then if you would know how long it would require to change and implement regulations to change the claim system to another system like leasing. I mean, was that addressed in the report, or do you maybe have knowledge of that?
Do you mean in the U.S. Geological Survey report?
Right.
On minerals? They did not look at access rights to minerals in the U.S.
Okay. And then something else I wanted to bring up. We're all aware of the problems as far as abandoned mine sites and the need to clean them up. I mean, we have them in New Mexico, and I know there are in other locations. One of the ways we might approach this issue is through third-party, non-governmental organizations assisting with remedy projects. So are you familiar with the so-called Good Samaritan legislation? It was a Senate bill, okay.
Yes.
Understanding that as it's written, I mean, do you think that this would be something that could work? Could it be implemented? The DOI is talking with the EPA and other agencies about how to address abandoned mines through the Good Samaritan arrangement, and I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. Is that a piece of legislation actually could be developed to work for what we're talking about in regards to abandoned mines?
Sure, thank you for the question. I'm not familiar with the specifics of that legislation, and that is an issue that would be dealt with by the Environmental Protection Agency. But I will say that Good Samaritan laws are endorsed in the administration's fundamental principles for mining reform, and we think that's an excellent way to begin some of the reclamation of these abandoned hard rock mine sites.
Okay, and you're right, and the bill is written out kind of outside the department's, the Interior's, purview, if you will, but it is a bill that has been introduced by, I think, Senator Heinrich and Risch. And then just last question for me is, can you weigh in on whether liability protections for the third parties doing reclamation work could help speed up the process in terms of these abandoned mines?
Sure. Again, not an expert on that particular piece of legislation, but I do understand that it is the liability concerns under certain other legislation that does hamper the ability of these third parties from coming in and be able to clean up those sites. So we certainly, the administration as a whole, certainly looks forward to working with Congress to find a good Samaritan solution that can work and can help leverage those private dollars to help address this abandoned hard rock mine problem.
Okay. And this final question, in your statement that you just made, there was a sentence in there about ensuring that the individual person or the community, was a beneficiary of this development. Right before you started talking about phones, batteries, that type of thing. Do you mean beneficiary in the sense of can go out and purchase a product, or do you mean beneficiary as in would have some kind of a vested interest and have a payout, monetary, or just a beneficiary as in product, for products sold as a result of mining?
Well, certainly, when we're talking about local communities and tribes benefiting, we, in one sense, we're talking about the potential for a royalty
Sure.
that would then take a certain, portion of the mineral value and allow that to be used for other purposes. But certainly, mining can be a very important component to local economies. So certainly, we're supportive of growing local economies through responsible and sustainable domestic mining.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me now recognize gentleman from California, Chairman Huffman. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir. Did Mr. Huffman? Did we get that?
Yeah, he is. I see him.
Mr. Huffman, you're recognized, if you can hear us. I don't think you can. Let me now invite Ms. DeGette if she has any questions for Dr. Felgus. Then we'll go back to Mr. Huffman after Mr. Carl.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It's great to see you, and welcome to our witness. I want to ask you a few questions about the way hard rock mining is treated compared to oil and gas. Mr. Felgus, am I correct that oil and gas extraction on public lands operates under a leasing system, and that this system requires the companies to pay for the public's resources that they extract from those lands?
That's correct.
And is it also the case that under the existing 150-year-old mining law, mining companies, including international mining companies, they don't have to ask permission to mine public lands in places like my home state of Colorado because they're not under a leasing system?
That's correct. They're free to access and stake claims on any unwithdrawn piece of public land.
And so are there any requirements for mining companies to alert nearby communities of their plans?
Not in the early stages, certainly not when it comes to staking a claim or doing certain smaller exploration work. Once they submit a plan of operations to develop a commercial scale mine, then they would enter the Nepa process and local communities would be notified.
But say for a small town, I think about my small towns in Colorado, if there was a company that wanted to mine, the local citizens might not have any idea about it until it's well far along into the process. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And now, is there anything inherently unique about the mining industry compared to other extractive industries like oil and gas that would make it impossible to transition to a leasing system that would require royalty payments?
I would just point to other nations that by and large use leasing systems. In fact, we may be the only country in the world that uses a claim system all the way through production.
So actually, we're the only country that you know of that doesn't use the same system for both. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, would we have to create a new and unique governing system for the mining industry if we were to transition to a leasing system?
Well, it all depends on how we structured that system, whether it was leasing or some sort of hybrid with claims and leasing or a third option.
But we could use existing systems if we wanted to. Is that right?
Sure, we believe that
Yeah.
we could modify the existing structure to accommodate that.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you a couple other questions. Am I correct that BLM has few options under current law to deny a proposed mine, even if that mine was on land, say, lands sacred to Native American tribes?
There are certain legal questions about the ability for the Bureau of Land Management to say no to a particular mine plan. Companies have to meet the regulations that are laid out by the BLM. But under the mining law, if there is a discovery of a valuable mineral, there is a right to mine. So there can't be a complete shutdown of the mining operation.
So do you know of a current regulation that says that BLM could regulate a mine on sacred lands?
I am not aware of any regulation that refers to sacred lands.
Okay, as defined by the Native American tribes?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, is it true that the mining industry is also able to pollute our water resources due to loopholes in the Clean Water Act, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and other environmental laws?
Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in those laws, but
Okay.
there are BLM regulations designed to cut down on water pollution.
Okay, so perhaps you could you could go talk to the legal experts and find out if there's anything in the Clean Water Act, the Resource Conservation Act, and other laws that would control pollution.
Yes, we can get back to you on that.
That would be super. Now, is it true that okay, I'm not going to ask that last question, and instead, Mr. Chairman, I'm done here, and I'm going to yield back. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think let me recognize Mr. Fulcher for 5 minutes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Carl is going to be next. I'm going to be
I'm working off the list I'm given
Oh,
by
okay.
staff.
All right,
So, Mr. Carl?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I appreciate that. Dr., is it Felgus? Did I
Felgus.
pronounce that correct? I'm from South Alabama, so we sound a little different, okay?
Okay, sure thing.
You know, last night, literally, when I was sleeping, your department announced it was not holding the remaining 2 court-ordered leases in the Gulf of Mexico this year. Gas prices are at an all-time high. You realize that, right?
Yes, sir.
Americans are hurting. When the cost of fuel goes up, everything goes up. A loaf of bread, a pair of shoes, a car, everything.
How long would
If we continue down this path, we're going to wind up like the UK, where the citizens are spending more money when the windmills aren't turning, and this economy is being crushed by it. And I want you to understand it. I want you to understand how the people in Alabama feel. We need help. We need the Gulf opened up. And the bureaucratic games that we're playing are not playing out well in the state of Alabama. Why are y'all not holding these offshore lease sales when the court mandated them? And please don't give me the bureaucratic answer, because we're all getting pretty sick of that.
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. I will say the president cares very deeply about the price of gas and the impact of inflation on American families, and he's doing everything he can to try to address that. That's one of the reasons why he ordered the largest ever release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
That does nothing.
Yeah, let's say that oil can be produced more quickly than oil from new leases, particularly offshore, which can take many years to be developed.
Well, in the business world, you plan many years ahead. And when you shut things off, you shut them off, and it takes many years to catch up. And the people in Alabama and the people in this nation are frustrated and they're mad. My phones are lit up. People don't like 5 gallons a gallon. And I don't think this administration truly understands how it affects the common person. The single moms that live from check to check. That double in fuel prices you see in so many places. Those independent truck drivers, I mean, they're talking to me. They're getting paid $7 a mile and paying $5+ for a gallon of fuel. They're losing money, and it's killing this economy. And then you turn around and shut these wells down, or excuse me, you stop the leases in the middle of the night that are court ordered. It doesn't make sense. We're supposed to be working together. I mean, when the environment takes preference over human life, and that's where we're at. I saw an illustration the other day from one of the senators. He was showing turtle eggs had more protection than a baby, and it's the truth. And we don't need to get in that discussion here. That's not what this is about. But what's happening? I promise you, in November, it's going to happen. November, you're going to see what people are going to speak. And I'm gonna say it from this podium right now. We've got to start drilling. We've got to get our people back to work. We've got to get fuel prices down, and releasing a few barrels of oil from our reserve is not going to get it done. Mr. Chairman, I'll give my time back. Thank you, sir, and I appreciate your patience.
Gentleman yields back, and let me recognize our colleague and Ms. Representative Dingle, but let me first thank her for the visit to the Dingle Refuge that recently named. And I appreciated that visit very much, and it was quite a nice and welcoming setup that was there. So with that, let me recognize Gentlelady for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it was an honor to have you there and see the wonderful natural resources we have in Michigan. I don't want to get sentimental today. Thanks for all my colleagues for holding this hearing on reforms to the mining law of 1872 and production, domestic production of critical minerals, which the chairman was just in my state. And for the auto industry, it's a very, very important question. It's good to see Dr. Felgus join us again. Steve was a valued member of our Natural Resources Committee staff for many years, and we appreciate you lending your time and expertise today on this important issue. If the next century is to be another America, a century where we're leading, it's essential that we secure a reliable and a sustainable supply of critical minerals and materials for EVs as well as other advanced industries. These are fundamental to U.S. competitiveness in creating good-paying jobs, particularly in my home state of Michigan, home to the domestic automotive industry, where electric vehicles are the future. But the Biden administration's 100-day supply chain review found that China controls an estimated 55% of global rare earths mining capacity and 85% of rare earths refining. The United States has fallen far behind. Dr. Felgus, do vulnerabilities in the supply chain for critical minerals and materials pose a threat to our economic welfare and national security?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I'll say yes, the administration is very concerned about supply chain vulnerabilities and how those would impact economic welfare and national security, which is one of the reasons why the President issued Executive Order 14017 on America's supply chains shortly after taking office. And those national security concerns were also reflected in the presidential determination under the Defense Production Act that the President signed in March. The need for minerals for our transition to a clean energy economy is also one of the reasons why we formed the Interagency Working Group on Mining Regulations, Laws, and Permitting. So while the administration is very focused on the economic welfare and national security impacts of our supply chains, we also want to make sure that any new production is able to meet the highest environmental and tribal consultation standards. And the Defense Production Act determination makes it clear that it does not affect environmental health or safety laws.
Thank you. And I want to talk here, my colleague Jared Hoffman shares this concern with me. And I know while you all have, and I shared this with the Secretary of Energy, you have your interagency task force like we did on electric vehicles. We want to bring a table together of the environmentalists and the unions to also talk about these issues so we can help everybody move forward on it, because it's a real competitive issue. We know that electric vehicles are the future, which is why China, the European Union, and other nations have made investments in EVs, and EV infrastructure is such a priority. They understand that orienting the industry toward lower and zero carbon emissions is not only good for the environment, but it will create jobs while supporting local economies and workers. Dr. Felgus, can we outcompete our geopolitical rivals like China without addressing these supply chain vulnerabilities for critical minerals and materials?
Well, I'm not an expert in geopolitics, so I can't give you a very complete answer to this question. But I will say the importance of staying competitive with other nations is one of the major themes that runs through all the reports that were developed pursuant to the Executive Order on America's supply chains.
Thank you. We cannot, I'm going to close by saying we can't let supply chain vulnerabilities become a full-blown crisis, which is why I appreciate the administration's efforts and the chairman's proposal to this end. It's why this hearing is so important. Additionally, I am a strong supporter of the Supply Chain Resilience subtitle included in the America Competes Act, which establishes a new Office of Manufacturing Security and Resilience responsible for implementing a $46 billion program to map and monitor our supply chains, providing financial assistance to strengthen supply chains and domestic manufacturing. As the conference process on USICA and America Competes commences, we have to seize the opportunity to enshrine this crucial program into law. It's why I thank the chairman, and I look forward to working with my colleague, Mr. Huffman on this subject because we have to deal with it if America is going to be competitive. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And let me, at the request of the ranking member, Ms. Harold, you needed an additional bit of time to make a statement or ask a question?
Just ask a question, yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
No,
Chair.
no
I'll be
problem.
brief. I wanted to ask, so back in February of this year, my colleagues and I sent a letter to Secretary Holland regarding military unrest around the world and around Russia that affect mineral supply chains. Unfortunately, and I'm going to streamline this, unfortunately, the worst has come to pass, of course, with Ukraine and Russia. They're now in the midst of war. The DOI declined to take the warnings about supply chains into account, leaving helium and uranium off the critical minerals list. So given the requirement in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 to forecast future supply and demand trends, can you explain why active military conflicts involving Russia, one of the largest global helium suppliers, was not considered when finalizing the critical mineral list?
Well, it's hard for me to speak exactly to the entire U.S. Geological Survey process for each mineral and how they analyze that for whether or not it would get included. I do understand that with helium, because the U.S. is the #1 world supplier for that element, that it was not necessary to put it on the list, but I would have to go get the U.S. Geological Survey to provide a more complete answer for you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Before I ask any questions, is there, Madam Ranking Member, is there anyone that needs to be recognized at this point?
No, sir.
Because I would be the last asking questions to Mr. Felgus, and then I would. Okay. All right, let me now, at this point, is there anyone on? No? Let me now, at this point, recognize myself for a couple of questions. Mr. Felgus, we heard a very salient point, which was the common person's needs out there, whether it is the rising cost of gas, inflation rate, supply chain, and the fact remains that for that person, the issue is the cost. The issue is not necessarily the reason, but the cost. And so let's say that we're dealing with immediate relief for that. If tomorrow morning, not only is this law okay, but it needs to even be more open to the mining industry in terms of extraction on our public lands. If that were to occur, when do you see that kind of production of critical minerals that we're talking about, or any other extraction, when would that production actually have, in terms of time, if you can, an effect on that price, on that cost?
Sure.
How long would it take?
Thank you. It would take quite a long time. I'm not an economist, but it takes a long time to find a mineral prospect, explore it, and then develop it into a commercial mine.
If you define domestic industry, my definition is domestic because it's being extracted from public lands in the United States. And then the definition of domestic changes in terms of most of the major mining industries that are operating on our public lands are multinationals, and many of them based outside the United States in terms of being a foreign company. Is that a correct assessment from?
Yes, that's correct. I don't have the exact numbers, but many of the mining companies that operate on public lands are owned by Canadian or Australian or Chilean or other countries, companies.
And most of the major conflicts that we're seeing in terms of siting and operation and process it and planning process that we're seeing across this country, whether it's the Grand Canyon, Resolution, Boundary, name it. Almost all of them have as the source of that conflict between whether it's indigenous communities, surrounding communities, environmentalists, land use planners, et cetera, water issues in Arizona. all those are then, if I'm not mistaken, the proponent for this mine is primarily a multinational corporation if you look at ownership. I mention that because that's an effect as well. And that if we're going to create this domestic product for our own security, there is no guarantees that that domestic product is not exported, as the majority of extractions on hard rock mining are to this present day.
That's correct, and that's why the refining and processing components of these supply chains are so important, and that's also a feature of the administration's approach.
I was getting cleanup. How many abandoned mines in public lands? You know, that's always been a figure, and estimated cost for cleanup.
There's no exact numbers that I can give you on that, unfortunately. There are a lot. Estimates range over 500,000 abandoned mine sites throughout the country. And we just don't have a good inventory of those sites. There hasn't been enough funding to go out there and actually count and identify where all of these are. And in terms of costs, we've seen estimates as high as $50 billion or more.
Yeah, and so dealing with this legacy of the mining industry, it's an important issue to all communities. If there was any other reason for a royalty, a lease versus a permit, this cleanup is going to require an investment beyond, to some point, the capacity of even us in Congress being able to designate that. It's going to require some responsibility and accountability on the part of the people doing business on our land. And so, isn't this reason enough for a royalty charge?
I think it's an excellent use for a royalty. Just as the coal industry has been paying for the last nearly 45 years, a fee on each ton of coal produced in order to address the legacy abandoned coal mines throughout the nation, and what has been a very successful attempt to address those. We think it would be fair for the hard rock mining industry to also contribute a portion to the cleanup of the legacy hard rock abandoned mine sites.
Okay, I think my time is ostensibly up, and let me now, and thank you, Mr. Felgus, for. Let me now recognize Mr. Graves for your 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Felgus, appreciate you being back here as a sacrificial lamb. Great to have you back in the committee again. Mr. Felgus, it has been amazing to me watching this administration blaming Vladimir Putin for the energy price crisis that is impacting every American family, people having to make decisions between refueling their car or paying their grocery bills. It has been amazing to me watching this administration, again, blame Vladimir Putin whenever the reality is well before the war in Ukraine, we saw one of the largest price spikes in gasoline costs that we've ever seen in our lifetime, only to continue. We then saw the administration try and deflect blame and say it's because of price gouging of the oil and gas companies. It's their fault, it's price gouging. But what the facts reveal is something very, very different. As you well know, it takes years to go from a lease sale when lands are made available for energy production onshore to go to production. It takes a decade for the offshore. And what is this administration doing? Absolutely nothing. This administration's energy strategy is no to everything. It's no to oil and gas, but you know what else? It's no to solar, it's no to wind, it's no to geothermal, it's no to everything. Because there's no plan, there's no strategy in place. There's nothing. You've shut down, speaking for my friend Mr. Stauber, you've shut down the Twin Metals mine. You can't have renewable energy production without the resources. You can't have it. This administration is solely responsible for the prices and the energy crisis that we're experiencing today. Solely responsible. This administration, what do you do to lower prices? You raise royalty rates 50%? I mean, who looks at this and say, oh yeah, I've got a great idea? I have never seen more inexperience and just doubling down on stupid strategies on energy in my entire life. Only last night to have the announcement that the area where 18% of the oil for the United States is generated, 18%, the Gulf of Mexico, and shut down the Cook Inlet lease sale offshore Alaska as well. To say that we're not going to do a lease sale. Let me say it again. The only president in modern history to say that we're not going to have a lease sale. We're not going to offer any new energy. Let's be crystal clear why there's an energy crisis. It's because of this administration. The Secretary of Energy just last week or week before said they haven't found price gouging. She said it. This administration's own officials. Look, you're a nice guy. I enjoyed working with you, and I know this isn't your fault. I know that you are sent here as a sacrificial lamb, crystal clear to all of us. But I'll tell you what, you've got 1 in every 5 Americans right now that can't afford to even cover their electricity bill. Like I said, that are having to make false choices between whether they're going to buy groceries for their family or they're going to fill their car so they can drive to work. This is absolutely disgusting. It is absolutely unforced errors, self-imposed impacts on the U.S. economy. And it's not limited to just energy, because energy is one of the most pervasive things. It is the primary driver of what we're seeing right now with inflation, with the supply chain problems, and probably contributing to worker shortage as well, because people can't afford to get to work. This administration can no longer have no to everything as an energy policy. I remind you, as I did last time, you can sit here and say, oh, we're doing all this for climate change. You know what? During the Trump administration, emissions went down an average of 2.5% a year. During the Biden administration, they've gone up 6.3%. You can talk about production levels, and I'm well aware, and as I stated at the beginning, sorry for taking your talking points. Yes, production's gone up, but because of the lead time, everything that's happening in regard to domestic energy production is because of what the Trump administration did. Under your administration, under the Biden administration, we've seen a significant drop in the approval of production. We've seen a significant drop in the approval of APDs. And as a matter of fact, just to put another finer point on it, if you look at bonus bids, which, as you know, is the auction bid that is provided at the beginning of a lease sale, the immediate payment that's made in the auction, do you know that those have gone down more than they're right now under this administration? They're less than 1/10 the revenue that was generated under the previous administration. Less than 1/10, despite the fact that energy prices are at record levels. That gives you some indication of how flawed these energy policies are. And for my home state, that's hurricane protection funding, coastal restoration funding, preventing additional disasters in FEMA funds. No is not an energy policy. This administration is solely responsible for the disasters we're experiencing now. And I urge you to take that message back. Don't sink with this ship. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and I don't believe there's any other further questions or dramatic entrances and exits, but we will, Mr. Felgus, the one question for information, and perhaps the ranking member needs it as well, I will encourage members to send you specific questions. We hope for a written response. And the one question that I'd like, there's been discussion about, and for the record, there's been discussion about all the permits that are out there that are not being used. Fine, whatever it is, that number 9,000. I would like to see that where principal ownership of those permits exists in terms of the companies that are holding on to them. And then we, as a comparison, contrast with, you know, the crocodile tears that we're hearing from industry and from members in terms of this issue. And so if you would do that, you know, I appreciated in your testimony that fact and science is going to drive this discussion. I appreciate the working group. There are balances to be reached here, but one of the premises has to be that this industry has to play by the rules, whether I object. Those rules, I think, need to be strengthened down the road, but at this point, the rules have to be, and I find it ironic that states can charge on state land for hard rock extraction, but the federal government next door, same piece of land essentially, can't. And so, with that, let me thank you and wish you the best. And you're not a sacrificial lamb, you're a lion. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Our next panel up, and we'll give it a little time for that to get situated and welcome, and then we'll begin with that part of it. Give me the introductions. Where are we? 10? Let me welcome the next panel and witnesses. And let me begin with, as I introduce the second panel, let me begin by welcoming you all here, thanking you very much for your time. And let me now recognize and introduce President Jeffrey Stiffarm from the Fort Belknap Indian Community. It's good to see you again, sir, and welcome, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I appreciate this time and to be here to speak about a very important matter, and I'd like to thank the Chair and the committee members for inviting me here to speak on behalf of my people. I come from the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, the home of the Aani and Nakota people. I am currently the tribal president there, and I'm here to speak on behalf of our people. I'm here to testify on the urgent need for mining reform and hard rock mining. Fort Belknap has been affected by lack of laws pertaining to hard rock mining. As some of you might know, the low Rocky Mountains on the southern end of our reservation, our people call them the fur caps, had an open pit, cyanide heap leach pad mining for about 20 plus years. And it was called the Zortman Landesky mine. And it was an experimental first cyanide heap leach mine in the world. And it was owned by Pegasus Mining. And whilst that was going on, there was a lot of findings of acid drainage leakage onto the reservation. But that didn't matter. They was allowed to get more permits and expand their mining up to 1,200 acres, even though cyanide was leaking into the Fort Belknap's water and groundwater. There was no rules in place to hold Zortman Landesky mines accountable, or Pegasus. As the contamination went on and Port Ballard started filing lawsuits, the state started taking notice. Pegasus Mine declared bankruptcy and left the cleanup to the state and the federal government, which cost around $3 to $4 million a year currently to help filter and clean water down onto our side of the reservation and into the towns of Zortman and Nandesky. And it's perpetual. So the taxpayers are responsible for these mining mistakes that they have done, and because there is no rules in place to hold them accountable for what they did. And our people will suffer forever for this. Where Zortman and Nandesky is currently mining, it was called a Grinnell Notch. That was part of our reservation that was forcibly taken from us by the federal government. They starved our people out to sign the agreement to turn that land over to them. I have some pictures here, if you can zoom in your camera. On this picture I'm showing you here, in the background, right here where my finger's at, that's our Sundance grounds. That's like our cathedral, where we sacrifice ourselves in prayer, in song and dance, to suffer for our people. And as you can see below here, this orange, that's our acid tailings running right through our Sundance grounds. My question to you is, would you like that running right next to your church, right next to your cathedral? I don't think so. Other thing I would like to add, is our people are second-class citizens to the federal government, always have been treated that way. We're not opposed to mining. We're opposed to what they have done to our people, what they have done to other communities, and what they continue to do because of no accountability, no rules. We're just dissatisfied, and we would like to thank you guys again for allowing us to say a few words on behalf of the Fort Ballard Bennett Committee and the Oneida and Nakota people. Can you hear? I'm open for questions now.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me now invite Mr. James Chen, Vice President of Public Policy at Rivian Automotive. Sir, time is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Harrell, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the honor of appearing before you today for this important hearing to discuss ways to modernize our domestic mining laws in the United States. As noted, my name is James Chen, and I'm the Vice President of Public Policy and Chief Regulatory Counsel for Rivian Automotive, LLC. We've already provided more extensive written comments to the committee for the record. My testimony today will be a brief summary of the main points of those written comments. Founded in 2009, Rivian is an independent U.S. company focused on the mission to keep the world adventurous forever through the design, development, manufacture, and distribution of class-leading all-electric trucks and sport utility vehicles. Rivian currently produces 3 vehicles in the United States: the R1T pickup, the R1S SUV, and the Amazon delivery van, named the EDV, all at our manufacturing facility in Normal, Illinois. Acquired in 2017 from Mitsubishi after they closed this facility in 2016, Rivian has invested nearly $2 billion to revitalize and transform the factory into a modern, high-tech manufacturing facility that employs nearly 5,000 employees in direct manufacturing jobs. Our growth at this plant continues, and we have plans to hire even more workers and add a second shift later this year. The R1T, our flagship vehicle, is the first all-electric pickup truck available in the U.S. market and has won numerous awards and accolades, including being named Motor Trend's 2022 Truck of the Year. With a 0 to 60 time as little as 3 seconds, towing capability of 11,000 pounds, payload capacity of over 1,700 pounds, and a quad motor design for the ultimate in torque vectoring, stability, and traction control, the R1T is a shining example of American ingenuity and American production. In fact, the R1T was recently named the coolest thing made in Illinois by the Illinois Manufacturers Association. Rivian was formed to help drive the transition to sustainable transportation, developed and manufactured in the United States in order to protect our planet for future generations. Our mission to keep the world adventurous forever extends beyond the impact of the products we build. As such, our commitments go as well towards decarbonizing our business and responsibly sourcing the components and elements that go into our vehicles, complementary and necessary work that is required to address the climate crisis. The battery is one of the most important components in the electric vehicle and accounts for a vast majority of the electric vehicle supply chain. A battery's raw materials, their processed derivatives, and the assembled cells themselves still largely exists outside U.S. borders. But with targeted policies, we enable an accelerated transition to a carbon-neutral, circular domestic economy that is far more sustainable and secure in the long run. Rivian is doing its part to create a strong, reliable, and transparent American battery supply chain, investing billions in manufacturing operations in Illinois, as mentioned, and soon as well in Georgia, working closely with domestic suppliers and others from allied nations and investing into early in-house development of new battery technology. By modernizing its mining laws and securing the battery and EV supply chain, the United States has an opportunity to lead the world, ensure the global mineral race does not become a race to the bottom. The Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act can help expand and accelerate domestic mineral development while also conforming to our bedrock environmental laws and protecting special places like our national parks and monuments. The bill also recognizes the impacts to rural communities and tribal nations. A majority of the U.S. nickel, lithium, copper, and cobalt reserves are located on or near tribal land, so tribal consultation is essential to any update to our domestic mining laws. The United States has the allies, the resources, and industrial capability to create a strong and safe domestic mineral supply chain. Lithium-ion technology was developed, and modern electric vehicles were commercially proven in the United States. America has consistently been a global leader in transportation technology. Let's not cede that leadership to foreign powers. Given the potential long-term security risks of having a weak domestic mineral supply chain, the federal government must put into place laws and policies that support responsible mineral development and extraction, as well as encouraging domestic supply. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me now recognize Mr. Sam Kalin. He is the William T. Schwartz Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Wyoming College of Law. Professor, you're recognized.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and offer my views on the mining law of 1872. I also appreciate the opportunity to appear remotely. My remarks today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Wyoming College of Law or its employees. As the nation's premier public land scholar, Charles Wilkinson, so aptly noted, the 1872 mining law is one of the last remnants of what he called a lord of yesterday, an anachronistic law that remains despite dramatic changes in policy since President Grant signed the law roughly 150 years ago. With the law's sesquicentennial upon us, this is surely a propitious moment to reflect on the urgency of reform as the nation confronts how to address its need for clean energy minerals. And perhaps one starting point for reflection is how the need for mining law reform has been appreciated now for well over a century, the subject of my remarks today. To begin with, it's worth noting that John Leshy, the expert on mining law, explained roughly 35 years ago that the law has remained in perpetual motion for decades, evading reform and yet universally acknowledged to be ill-suited to modern times. Historian Gordon Bakken, while explaining how the mining law was designed in the post-Civil War era to regulate and confirm mining practices, echoes an assessment by Jared Diamond that suggests that this federal statute, and I quote, is among the greatest failures of judgment in world history, end quote. That may sound a bit too hyperbolic, But as the former Secretary of Interior Ken Salazar testified in 2009, the law, unfortunately, according to Interior Secretary Salazar at the time, despite decade after decade of fights about how it is that we should reform the mining law, all of those efforts have failed, end quote. My written testimony chronicles some of these efforts in detail, but a few salient points are worth noting. As early as 1880, the Public Land Law Commission suggested the need for reform as it identified abuses surrounding the use of the 1872 mining law during the law's first decade. Then, as Congress from the turn of the century on began to develop policies for other resources on the public lands, it routinely rejected the 1872 mining law's approach of affording miners of hard rock minerals the ability to discover valuable mineral deposits on available public lands and mine those minerals without paying any value back to the United States and the American people. Today, consequently, the mining law stands alone amid the host of other natural resource programs that provide at least some measure of economic return to the public from the use of the nation's public lands. Indeed, as far as I'm aware, the mining law remains unique worldwide in its a failure to employ some form of valuation method for lands owned and administered by a federal, state, or provincial government. Not surprisingly, therefore, President Roosevelt's Interior Secretary in the 1930s called for leasing. The 1950s Paley Commission recommended establishing a leasing system. Then reforming the old law surfaced as a recommendation of the 1960s Public Land Law Review Commission. Interior Secretary Udall in 1969 lamented how reforming the 1872 law was one of, and I quote, the most important pieces of unfinished business on the nation's natural resource agenda, end quote. In its 1970 report, 1/3 of the nation's land, the Public Land Law Review Commission observed how the general mining law of 1872 has been abused. But even without that abuse, it went on, it has many deficiencies and recommended a combination of elements of the leasing system in assuring a fair return to the United States. Reform conversations continued throughout the 1970s, and even the U.S. Government Accountability Office, for example, carried forward a recommendation for reform in 1979, just to name one. Today's hearing, with the law's sesquicentennial upon us, is part of a conversation that began back in the 1880s and one that has continued almost unabated since. Reform is undeniably now part of the law's heritage, hopefully approaching a historic moment toward resolution. I want to thank the committee again for providing me with this opportunity to share my thoughts on mining law reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me now recognize our final witness, Ms. Deborah Stru as an environmental permitting and government relations consultant and co-founder and director of Women's Mining Coalition. Ms. Stru, you're recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Harrell. Very much appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Women's Mining Coalition. Members of the subcommittee, the U.S. is standing at a minerals crossroad. Either we can produce minerals from domestic mines, which are the cleanest and safest mines in the world, or we can import minerals from our adversaries, ignoring Chairman Manchin's warning that Russia and China will weaponize critical minerals against us, jeopardize our national security and economy, and thwart the transition to clean energy. Enacting H.R. 7580 will put Russia and China in charge of our future. Please don't be fooled by the bill's title, the Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act. This bill will not promote responsible development of critical minerals because it's designed to restrict mining on federal lands for all minerals, including the lithium, rare earths, antimony, cobalt, nickel, graphite, and copper that are critical for clean energy. President Biden's interagency working group has called for public comments to inform future mining law legislation and is seeking ideas about how to incentivize critical minerals production, structure a royalty to reward taxpayers and still encourage mineral production, and improve permitting. Forging ahead with this bill to gut the mining law prior to the public comment deadline renders the interagency working group's work irrelevant. HR 7580 is premised on an anachronistic mischaracterization of mining that ignores the environmental safeguards that federal environmental laws require at modern mines. There are no exemptions or loopholes for mining in the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, or any of the other federal environmental laws applicable to mining. Mines must comply with the same federal environmental laws as all other industries. The allegation that the mining law needs overhauling because it does not include environmental protection is tantamount to saying the Clean Water Act is deficient because it does not protect air quality. The mining law governs land tenure and how citizens obtain mineral rights on certain Western public lands. If claim owners beat the daunting 1 in 1,000 odds of finding a mineral deposit that can become a mine, they must then secure environmental permits and provide the federal government with financial assurance to guarantee the mine will be reclaimed before mining can begin. The U.S. permitting process takes 7 to 10 years to complete, compared to Canada and Australia, where mines get permitted in 2 to 3 years with similar environmental safeguards as U.S. mines. The lengthy U.S. permitting process means that there are no shovel-ready projects and is the main reason why there are only 30 active metal mines in Nevada, which is the country's largest public lands mining state. Discussing the need to increase domestic critical minerals production, U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm recently said, "It takes forever to get a new permit. How crazy is that?" HR 7580 transforms Secretary Granholm's takes forever crazy permitting process into mission impossible by creating unachievable standards, allowing mine opponents to declare many areas unsuitable for mining, and placing more lands off limits. In a 2018 final rule, the U.S. EPA concluded hard rock mining regulations and bonding requirements provide comprehensive and effective environmental protection and guarantee today's mines will not become tomorrow's environmental problems. But ignoring the EPA's finding, HR 7580 fills an imaginary regulatory vacuum with impractical new requirements. The industry has long supported a royalty structure that places mineral producers and taxpayers on the same side of the financial equation so everyone can go to the bank together. But the gross royalty and fees in HR 7580 are not intended to generate revenue. They're designed to make mining unprofitable in order to curtail mining. The mandatory conversion of mining claims into leases in HR 7580 will destroy self-initiation and the security of land tenure needed to justify the hundreds of millions of dollars of private sector capital required to discover minerals and develop mines. And the system in HR 7580 is based on an existing program for acquired lands, which fails to produce minerals and has only generated $8.7 million in royalties in fiscal year 2018. HR 7580 will cede control of our mineral future to Russia and China. It guarantees the U.S. will continue down a path of increased mineral insecurity, reduced prosperity, and a much more dangerous future. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. My husband came down with COVID, so I could not travel at the last minute, but I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And on that note, let me remind the witnesses that we will limit, or that we're going to now begin the questioning process. And let me now turn and recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Westerman, for 5 minutes. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. And Mr. Chairman, I apologize for not being here at the start of the meeting. I was testifying in another hearing, but
Well, I just want to tell you that your designee has done a magnificent job.
I'm sure she's done a
And,
much better job than
and
I
I'm
would.
gonna miss her, Westerman, when she leaves it.
But I would like to submit for the record my opening statement. And thank you. I find it ironic that we're having a hearing on mining act reform. And I do believe we all agree on one thing. There is a shortage of elements and metals and minerals, rare earths in the United States. And we're dealing with a majority who has already voted to take uranium, our best uranium deposits out of possible development, that in their failed Build Back Better plan actually wanted to close down a copper mine that could produce 20% of the United States demands for copper for the next 50 years. And also, we have an administration that's pulled the lease on the Twin Metals project. So this is something we definitely need to talk about. But I think we need to be talking about it in different terms. And GAO has issued a report saying that the average permitting timeline takes about 2 years, but in reality, we have observed that it often takes much longer. In fact, I have a chart right here that shows the process for approving new mining projects in the U.S. While they're unrolling that, and it may take a while, Ms. Strusacker, how long does the average hard rock mine take to become active in the United States from exploration to production, and why does it take so long?
Thank you, Ranking Members Westerman. It takes from first discovery to developing a mine, it can take as long as 20 years. And the reason for that is twofold. One, hard rock minerals are very difficult to find, so it takes a while to explore for them, which is one of the reasons a lease will not work for us, because they are time limited. We need to be able to be on the ground for as long as it takes to explore for the minerals, discover them, and then put them into production. And that's, our other countries can do it in 2 to 3 years using the same safeguards as we do here. And there's really no reason it needs to take that long. The Nepa process is the primary reason it takes so long, but that's not the source of our environmental protections. Our environmental protections come from the laws that apply to mines like other industries, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, and others.
This looks like something you would see on a comedy skit, but unfortunately, it's the sad reality of what it takes to permit a mine in Nevada. How would this bill affect the timeline going forward for mining projects? Would this get more simple, or would it get more complicated?
Oh, I'm afraid it would get much more complicated, and it wouldn't add any other increment of environmental protection. I mean, we already have comprehensive environmental protection. The EPA found that in a very intensive rulemaking in the 2016, 2018 timeframe.
We would have a lot of squeeze and not much juice out of this new law. I've got to move on. I wish we could talk more about that. But Mr. Chin, you mentioned building electric batteries in the United States, which is a great thing. We need to do more of that. Where are 80% of the world's batteries built today?
Well, we source our cells from Asia, where most of the battery cells are produced today.
China. When you say
China,
Asia.
Korea, Japan.
Right.
Yes.
And so when you build this battery plant, where are you going to get the lithium, the metals, the rare earths that are needed to build the batteries? Where will they come from?
Well, that's why we're here today, to talk about where we can create additional source. So we are currently looking, frankly, literally around the world and working with various suppliers and mineral resource extractors.
Would it surprise you to know that USGS says that we have all of the elements and minerals that we need right here in the United States?
No, it would not. In fact, we're speaking to quite a few U.S. companies about resources in the United States. As an example, we are aware of, for example, lithium deposits both in the Southwest as well as in North Carolina, and are in talks with certain companies about access to those resources.
We have huge lithium deposits in my district in South Arkansas, but there's also the hurdle of building a lithium refinery and processing it in the United States. How long do you think that would take? What are you projecting?
That's a good question. We, as a car manufacturing company, do not get into the processing, but we are talking to suppliers about that.
It definitely affects your supply chain. Wish we had more time. I'm out. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Gentleman yields. Recognize Representative Dingell for 5 minutes. Representative, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member for convening today's hearing again, and to the panel, choose witnesses for their patience. As you know, this issue really does matter. Domestic supply and production of critical minerals are fundamental to the automotive industry, the economic engine of my home state of Michigan. Electric vehicles, which are the future of the automotive industry, and it's where we are headed, are going to require substantially more minerals than a gas-powered car. And that's why addressing the critical mineral supply is fundamental to clean energy, to the clean energy economy, as well as the economic future of working Americans, not only in my district, but across the country. So, Mr. Chen, we know that EVs are vital for achieving our climate goals, and we support a rapid deployment of them, but we want to make sure they're built responsibly. Can you tell us what Rivian is doing to lower the overall mineral demand for each of their trucks? And is Rivian engaged in any efforts for battery and mineral recycling?
Thank you for that question, Representative. Yes, Rivian is involved heavily in looking at the entire supply chain of electric vehicle batteries and the cells that we use in our products. To respond directly to your question, we are looking not only at domestic supply from the get-go, we are also looking at recycling options. We have designed our batteries, for example, to be second-use batteries or second-life batteries right from the vehicle without any further modification. If you look at an electric vehicle battery, you have a useful life of 10 plus years. Once that battery capacity falls below roughly 70%, there's still adequate storage, and we are able to take those and actually put those into stationary storage applications for yet another decade. After that, we are looking at recycling and recapturing them. Unlike our rivals in the internal combustion engine side, the battery's precious metals aren't actually consumed during the use of that battery, during the recharge and charge cycles. We're actually able to extract those minerals, recycle them, and put them into new batteries for repurposing.
So let me ask you this then, in addition, what signals are you getting from shareholders about sourcing for critical minerals for your vehicles?
More and more shareholders are recognizing the importance of supply chain and responsible supply chain. That's why we're here today to work with Congress, with this committee, to look at ways of structuring laws in the United States to help bring on domestic manufacturing, domestic supply chains, and responsible production overall.
Mr. Chen, is Rivian a member of the Zero Emission Transportation Association? What is the industry outlook for supporting more responsible domestic mining?
Yes, we are absolutely members of Zeta, and we are, as an industry, heading in the direction for more and more responsible production and manufacture. We signed on to the Global Climate Initiative, where we are working towards reaching zero emissions by, I believe it's 2035. We continue to look at our supply chain and our own practices to reduce our carbon footprint and the use of our materials as much as possible. One initiative we're particularly proud of is our Ocean Plastics Initiative, where we have diverted plastics going into the waste stream and have actually made them into durable totes and supply containers that are used in our factory for production. We've taken additional plastics and recycled them and made them actually into panels for a number of our vehicles.
Thank you for your testimony today. I'm going to yield back in a minute, Mr. Chairman, but I want to make this point to to all of my colleagues, that I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on the issue of domestic production of critical minerals in a way that we can bring everybody together, the manufacturers, the environmentalists, the unions, the workers together. So it's vital for America's economic competitiveness, our national security, and our environmental future. So I think this hearing's one of the more important ones we're doing right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Lady yields. Let me recognize Mr. Fulcher. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for Ms. Strusacker, please. Ms. Strusacker, the Stibnite project you may be familiar with, that happens to be in my home state of Idaho. And that that represents the largest reserve of antimony outside of Russia or China. And that mine is actually in a position to where it could move quite quickly if it had the permissions to do so. This is a critical mineral, as you know. This is used in a broad base of applications, next generation utility scale batteries, important military applications, munitions, infrared, semiconductors, wind turbines, all kinds of things. If this bill were enacted, can you tell me what kind of impacts you would foresee for that project and others like it?
Thank you, Mr. Fulcher. I can't emphasize the importance of the Stibnite Gold Project, gold and antimony project enough as an important source of critical minerals. If this bill were enacted, I'm not sure that the project proponent, Perpetua Resources, would be able to justify the investment they are proposing to make of $1 billion to clean up that site, because they would have no security of tenure under the leasing system that is proposed in HR 7580.
So we got, just as an FYI, my office was contacted, I believe, just yesterday, and there's interest through Defense Logistics Agency, DOD, and others, specifically concerned about the stockpile of antimony. And so this is an interesting situation where we've got one component of the federal government that's raising concerns and trying to put some urgency into the situation, and other that's looking to potentially extend a timeline so that it can't be engaged. But as you alluded to, there's some cleanup that comes with this project, and this would be done by private industry. I find it interesting that this was actually caused, if you will, by a World War II demand by the federal government, which led to the situation that they have right now. But here we've got a private company looking to basically clean this up as a function of that. It looks like a win-win to me. Do you see it that way?
Absolutely, Congressman. It is a win-win for American taxpayers that we have a company that is proposing to invest $1 billion of private sector money to cleaning up what was an environmental problem that was created during World War II when the Japanese blockaded this antimony source the country was using in China. So, you know, we kind of see history repeating itself with Russia and Europe right now. It is an extremely important project that demonstrates that reprocessing and remining of historic mine sites can be an important source of critical minerals, and that private sector involvement in those sites can be a very effective way to clean up what was an abandoned mine. And we're very fortunate that Perpetua Resources is proposing to make that investment.
So we're almost out of time, but are you familiar with any other examples where there's been a similar situation where private industry has moved in and operators take on a environmental cleanup project?
Modern mining is absolutely the best way to address historic problems at old pre-regulation mining sites. Unfortunately, the liability issues associated with doing that chills people's ability to do that. So we could enhance reclamation of these AML sites by enacting some Good Samaritan legislation.
Thank you, Ms. Stru. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And gentleman yields. Let me now recognize the chair of the Oversight Subcommittee. Representative Porter, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kalin, the Forest Service has repeatedly said that they can't say no to mining projects. What do you mean by that? What do they mean by that?
Well, what they mean is that when you get a mining claim right now under the law, that is a possessory right. It is a property right. And so in order for the Forest Service to be able to say no, the argument from industry has always been that that would effectively take a property right away from the industry. There are a lot of questions about whether the Forest Service and legal issues about whether the Forest Service might have the authority to say no, but I think that's why there's need for reform in order to be able to clarify what that authority really is.
Does the mining law establish hard rock mining as the highest and best use of the land?
What it does is historically, it has been perceived by agency officials dating back to the early 1900s as effectively evincing the highest and best use of the lands. So while there's nothing specific in the law that says that, because of the way the operation of the law works, that's the way it's been treated historically. So yes.
Well, and I think what we see from that is when we have competing permits on public land, what we see the agency doing is something like this. Like, say they have Project A, which is mining minerals on US land to sell to competitor countries. And that has a pretty significant environmental harm, even if it's properly cleaned up. It's a big change to the environment. And Project 2 is solar panels on that same public land that would power a neighboring city. And of course, there's still disruption to the land. There might still be environmental impacts. But let's say they decide that the environmental harm is 2. Under current Forest Service policy, the Bureau of Land Management, they tell us, the Forest Service, that they basically have to pick Project A. They have to pick the mining project because they cite back to that highest and best use of the land. So we all think that we need to be doing more to develop appropriately as much U.S. mineral capacity as we can. But at the project by project level, we're just not seeing thoughtful best use decisions on each and every parcel. Sometimes the best use may be hard rock mining, and sometimes it may be a different project. But the way the law is currently set up doesn't get us to that because of this 150-year-old law and the interpretations of that over time. I want to turn to Mr. Chen. Thank you very much for being here. Rivian is headquartered, as you know, in my home district of Irvine, and I'm grateful to your colleagues for showing me around. I wanted to ask you, what would reforming the mining law of 1872 do to improve Rivian's supply chain and their ability to create jobs here in the United States?
I think reforming the mining law of 1872 would do a lot to help increase domestic supply of critical minerals. Our CEO was recently quoted in the Wall Street Journal as mentioning that there's an upcoming supply shortage of cells, and that supply shortage traces back to those critical minerals. By reforming the laws of the United States, the mining laws of the United States, to take into account not only increased production, but responsible increased production, we have an opportunity to lead the world in not only increasing our supply, but showing that this can be done in a responsible way.
Thank you very much. Do you currently face supply chain issues relating to having to import minerals?
Well, like the rest of the industry and the current economic factors, we do face challenges. We do believe, and again, our CEO was quoted recently, I think as soon as yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, that we do see ourselves climbing our way out of the supply chain constraints. That all said, the way to make sure that this is a long-term solution and not just a temporary one is to increase access to domestic mineral supplies.
I love that answer about looking for long-term solutions, because I think too often Congress does not. We are trying to solve yesterday's problem tomorrow. This was a problem that has been a long time in coming, as we've seen electric vehicle production and battery production ramp up, and it is time to act today to reform the mineral law so that we set ourselves up on a good path for the right kind of law that can facilitate our ability as the United States to manufacture electric vehicles here in the United States. I know you are opening a new plant here, and so I'm really, really excited about being able to advance this law in a way that both protects the environment and encourages our business community. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
You recognize Mr. Carl? Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mrs. Stu Shacker, did I pronounce that? Did I get close?
Got close.
Okay, Stru. Okay, I'm sorry. How would you characterize the environmental protection in the United States compared to other major producers of critical minerals in the world, such as China?
Congressman Carl, we have the cleanest and safest mines in the world. And it is important that we responsibly source the minerals that we need for the clean energy transition from environmentally responsible sources. And that's right here in the USA. Places like China and Russia, where there's very little environmental protections in place, there's slave labor used in some places. So our laws on not only for protecting the environment, but also worker health and safety are absolutely the world's best example. Other countries come to us when asking how do we protect the environment at our mines.
Thank you. I got to go through the Iron Range in Minnesota, and I was so impressed with what I saw out there. Of course, we've got the copper mining out there shut down, which that copper is now coming from China, so I understand. So we're kind of a stalemate. Second question, what would the impact impose, and what would be the impact of imposing an 8% gross royalty on existing mines, and how would this impact the domestic industry and the needs for these materials like electric car companies?
Oh, it would have a devastating impact if you were to impose a royalty on currently operating mines. And in fact, we believe that that would probably expose the federal government to takings. Putting a royalty like that on an existing operation where there are many, many years of investment-backed expectations that have gone into the financial analysis of the economics of that mine would be totally disrupted by an 8% retroactive royalty, and it would probably make many of those mines uneconomic to continue to operate. So the outlook would be that mines would shut down, jobs would be lost, we'd lose production of important critical minerals, and we'd become even more dependent.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Mr. Chen, real quick, what recommendations have you and others in your industry made to the administration to change our policy to ensure that we can acquire minerals that you need here in the U.S.? What changes, recommendations have you made?
Our recommendations are certainly to update the mining laws to catalyze new investment in responsibly sourced domestic, domestic mineral supply, as well as shoring up existing allies and trading partners to create new ones like in Eastern Europe and the Pacific Rim. So our recommendations to the government has been an all of the above approach, not only on the domestic side, but also with certain trading partners. We've also made recommendations outside the area of mining as well on workforce development and consumer-facing policies as well.
So with that said, what do you see as the biggest challenge to building a domestic mineral supply chain?
I mean, currently there are several. One of those is availability. One of those is building not only the access to the critical minerals themselves, but the processing that goes along with all of that as well. So you don't just take lithium or cobalt or nickel and just throw them into batteries. There's an entire value chain that must be built up, an entire industry that must be built up to take advantage of that. So we see the challenge for us is not only the supply itself, but be able to have all the supporting infrastructure to get to that result. So this is a long-term solution that starts with the minerals and starts with the access.
How far out do y'all project your business? I mean, do you move from year to year, or are you looking 5 years out?
We look not only year to year, 5 years out, 10 years out, we're looking 30 years out as well.
Thank you. That's the point I'm trying to make here. We have got to start planning much further out than the next election, and that's the problem we're having here in Congress. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I turn it back to you. Thank you, sir.
And let me now recognize Mr. Moore. Sir, you recognized?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think that we would all agree that we get stuck in these 2-year cycles of 2-year election cycles for those in the House of Representatives, and our CEOs, our industry, and our private sector folks. You have to be thinking 30 years out, and we just make it virtually impossible for you to predict what environment it's going to be. And I'm firmly committed. Particularly Utah 1, my district has one of the most dynamic, diverse workforces in the country, with different areas with mining and energy, but also tourism and conservation. Like we have to be more thoughtful about this. Ms. Strusacker, along those lines, we are all concerned, and I believe we are, regardless of party, we are all concerned about maintaining a healthy, safe environment. We're aware of abandoned hard rock mines from pre-regulation times. What protections are in place to ensure that today's mines won't become tomorrow's environmental problem? Can you give me any thoughts on that? Ms. Strusacker? What's that? Oh, looks like we're having a technical problem. Okay. Ms. Strusacker, can you hear me? Okay, I did get a reaction there. We were having technical difficulties earlier. I apologize. Let me just quickly ask a question on, we're all concerned about a healthy, safe environment. What protections are in place to ensure that today's mines won't become tomorrow's environmental problem?
Thank you. We have a whole host of federal and state environmental laws and regulations that guarantee that today's mines are developed in a responsible manner that protects the environment. And the EPA took a very close look at this in 2018 and concluded that this regulatory framework provides comprehensive environmental protection and also financial assurance. For example, in Nevada, where I live, the state and federal agencies have $3.4 billion in reclamation bond monies to guarantee today's mines will be responsibly reclaimed.
Would you say that that review that was done in 2018 and what you've set what's been established is sufficient with a forward-leaning outlook? So we're not just thinking about this year, next year. We're forward-linking. And would any additional environmental protection provisions in this bill add any benefit?
Thank you. The bill would add no incremental benefit in terms of protecting the environment. And the way our environmental laws and regulations are set up for mining, they're already forward-looking. Because in order to get a permit from the BLM or Forest Service, you have to demonstrate that the mine will comply with existing federal and state regulatory requirements. So it's a living regulation, if you want to look at it that way. So if there's an update to an air quality standard or a water quality standard or a new law that's put on the books, it's automatically included in part of the compliance requirements under the BLM's and the Forest Service's current regulations.
So it allows for it to be dynamic in nature where you can continually update as we go. That's a point I wasn't fully aware of either, so that's good. That's great to hear. We all agree that reclaiming abandoned mines is extremely important. What are some proposals to pay for it that won't necessarily discourage mining investments on federal lands?
Well, I think one of the best things you could do, and you could do it without changing the law, is to, through the appropriations process, designate that the mining claims fees that are in excess of what's required to administer the mining law program be earmarked for abandoned mine reclamation. Right now, those excess fees, and they're on the order of about $30 million a year, just vanish into the ether of the general treasury. If they were earmarked for abandoned mine reclamation, we could start building an AML reclamation fund right now.
Are you familiar with the so-called Good Samaritan legislation that allows third parties to get involved in mine cleanup? And do you think is industry supportive of this idea?
I'm sorry, yes. Since I've been working on this issue for the last 30 years, industry has been very supportive of a Good Samaritan law, and yes, that's an important step forward in reclaiming more abandoned mines.
I've seen from the Utah Mining Association groups that have been heavily involved in making sure that they leave the area better than they found it. Like they're always engaged in these types of good ideas that are productive solutions. So thank you so much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Now we recognize Mr. Tiffany, sir, you're recognized. You can't hear you? Yeah. technical issue gets decided. I apologize to the witnesses, but
Test, test. Dominic, can you hear us? This is 1324.
Copy that. We hear you on the platform. Copy that.
Are we back online?
Yes, we are for now.
Great, thank you. Cancel.
Testing, testing. Dominic, can you hear us? 1324.
Yes, we hear you on the platform.
Great, thank you.
This is Nancy on remote. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Thank you.
Stand by. We'll try to get it started shortly.
Let me reconvene the meeting, and I appreciate the time from the witnesses. I had to go take care of this myself. I got into the fuse box, and we changed, and it's, I believe it's functional. Let me now recognize Mr. Tiffany for 5 minutes. Sir, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much, and I'm glad you had the fuses to get it done. Yeah, I'd like to ask a question of Mr. Chen. Do you believe energy and mineral independence is important for America?
Thank you for that question. Energy and mineral independence is not simply important, it's vital to the survival and leadership displayed by this country.
Do you think it's ethical for us to be getting some of our, especially our mineral resources, from countries that do not share our standards as far as work standards, environmental standards, when we have those minerals right here in our country?
That's a great question, and it is not. And it is, in fact, why Rivian has a robust supplier code of conduct and policies in place to ensure that wherever our suppliers are worldwide, that we are ensuring that they adhere to the highest standards that we hold ourselves to. Obviously, having a domestic supply chain and domestic suppliers would make enforcing of those that much easier, and why it's so critical that we look at and reform our current mining laws.
That America look at and reform its mining laws?
Yes, that the United States look at reforming and modernizing our laws to ensure that we are taking into account all the factors that I mentioned during my opening remarks about ensuring critical mineral supplies, but also ensuring protection of our bedrock environmental laws, protecting our sacred spaces, and ensuring that we are consulting with local and rural communities and the tribes.
Do you source any of your materials from China?
Yes, we do. Currently, I don't have the specific figures, but some of our components and resources do come from suppliers in China.
Can you assure us today on this panel that there are none of your products in the region of China?
I'm sorry, Congressman, you broke up during the feed. I didn't hear the entire question.
Can you assure those of us on the panel that none of your products you're sourcing are coming from slave labor in China?
We actually do have a robust anti-slave labor policy that we push out to all of our suppliers, and we have mechanisms in place to audit them to ensure that this is not the case.
Do you think the Nepa process should be streamlined to protect environmental standards, but to end this process of taking 10, 20 years to get permits completed that companies are doing in a responsible manner?
We agree that the use of the NEPA process is important, but certainly that there are ways we should and could improve and streamline that process without compromising environmental protections or other issues that are important to the United States.
Yeah, thank you for your answers. We're really receiving conflicting messages from the Biden administration here in rural America. Just got a note yesterday while President Biden is talking about let's do some subsidies for fertilizer, things like that in agriculture and encouraging agricultural production because we're seeing food shortages at this point. In the meantime, they're advancing the CRP program, which takes agricultural land out of production. Very conflicting. We're seeing the same thing with mining, where we see these conflicting messages. And the unfortunate part is those that seek to curtail production seem to be winning. Ms. Strusacker, is this accurate that it appears those that are opposed to natural resources utilization actually have the upper hand in the current administration?
Mr. Tiffany, unfortunately, I believe that's the case. I mean, I think you look at HR 7580, it's designed to curtail mining on federal land. So there is a real mixed message here about the need for domestic minerals and strengthening our supply chains, and yet an initiative like this that is absolutely counter-opposed to that. I'd also like to say that the interagency working group that Dr. Felgus described in the first panel is a very important opportunity for numerous stakeholders to come together and see if there's some things that we could fine tune in the current process, but HR 7580 is not the answer.
Thank you for your answer. What we're seeing is American weakness and the problems that we have here in America, whether it's inflation, the border crisis that's going on, crime at record levels in cities across America, all these things, energy and mineral independence, they're all real easy to fix. It's unfortunate that committees like this are not advancing proposals, as cited by Ms. Strusacker just in the last minute here, that we don't have things that could actually turn this around. All I can say is to Americans out there, the solutions are simple. But the current Congress leadership is not bringing those solutions to we Americans. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yields. Ms. Harold, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so thankful for your technical skills, but next time thermostat skills. It's getting cold in here.
I know.
Thank you.
It was an offset when I moved the one, never mind.
Thank you. Anyway, I do want to say one thing about my colleague from California who had the chart up earlier, the chart A, mining, chart B, solar, but there was concern about chart A getting the priority, but the clear and concise answer needs to be, and I think we all get this, is you cannot have B without A. You cannot have solar, you cannot have these green projects without critical minerals, and I just want to make sure we're very clear on that. But with that, I do have a question for Ms. Strusacker, and I'm hoping you're hearing that. I hope that's still working. Federal oil, gas, and coal all operate in the United States with a 12.5% royalty. Why shouldn't hard rock mining have the same rate? How would that look like?
Thank you very much for that question. You can't just cookie cutter a royalty system that was designed for oil and gas and superimpose it upon a completely different industry, which is hard rock mining. I have, and I was hoping to be able to pass this around during the hearing. This is a picture of high-grade gold and silver ore from a mine in Nevada. There is no valuation for this rock. In order for the products, the gold and silver, to be liberated from this rock, we have to grind it, we have to crush it, we have to leach it, we have to do many things. And that has to be part of the consideration in a structure for a royalty. In contrast, there is a market for crude oil, basically as it comes right out of the ground. You can find it in the Wall Street Journal, per barrel price per day. There is no price or valuation for this crude ore. And so that's why you can't simply use what's in place for oil and gas and put it onto a completely different industry.
Right. And so what kind of return to the taxpayer should we expect if a high royalty rate were suddenly put on the operators?
I think what you would find is most mines or many mines would become uneconomic. So you would have royalty of zero from a mine that can't be in production because the royalty is too high to make it profitable. So you'd lose jobs, you lose tax revenue, and certainly we'd lose mineral production, making us even more reliant on foreign sources for minerals.
All right, thank you. And I wanted to follow up with Mr. Chin on a question that he just answered for Congressman Tiffany as it relates to child slave labor. I know that if Pete Stauber were sitting here today, that would absolutely be a question he would ask. And you mentioned that you have policies in place or an audit process in place. Who actually can perform those audits, especially in countries like China? How do you have the capability to perform those audits, to have that access, if you will, to their mines?
Well, we actually work with our first-tier suppliers and our second-tier suppliers to actually provide them the standards that we expect them to adhere to and do this under contract. And part of those contracts include the ability to have audits. We would often use third-party auditors to do that, but then we would also push down for suppliers onto them the obligation to provide us reports from auditors that they may choose to be able to review their practices.
But I mean, can you honestly guarantee to the American consumer that there is absolutely no child labor being used to produce the minerals necessary for these batteries without hesitation?
We are using all of the best tools possible and commercially available to us to ensure that that is the case.
But I mean, just yes or no, can you 100% assure the American consumer that none of these batteries are being produced by child slave labor?
Again, we're using the best available tools to us to ensure that that is not the case.
But that is a no, because you can't for sure guarantee, but that's okay. But I do appreciate the fact that you are looking for long-term solutions, because my question was, I think you already kind of alluded to this, with so many now opportunities to go green and so much competition for our minerals, my problem is, or my question is, do you concern yourself with this, the availability or the stability of minerals being available because of all the pull now for, whether it's for windmills or for other green products? I'm just wondering how concerning is that to you in terms of your projections? I know you said earlier you are looking out for 30-year projections, some of your products.
Yeah, that's exactly why we're here today, testifying on an area that is not directly tied to electric vehicle manufacturing, but is further on down the supply chain. It is absolutely critical for us as we do our long-term planning to be able to find a diversified source of critical minerals for our suppliers and for us.
Yeah, and just one question. How much does one of these trucks cost?
So the R1T starts at $67,500 and goes up there depending on how you option it.
Awesome, thank you. Yep. Thank you. I went a little bit over, but thank you.
No, thank you. Thank the ranking member. Let me recognize myself. President Stiffarm, let me, and thank you very much for the discussion on the cultural significance of the Little Rockies to your people and what the threat of mining means to your cultural heritage and the history. Part of the discussion has been about that was damage done then, we're moving into a new era. And I if nothing changes, Mr. President, and we acknowledge that there has to be collateral damage of some sort in this process, if nothing changes, then do you think that in terms of the tribe, in terms of sacred sites, in terms of other issues, what does good faith tribal consultation look like, absent in relationship to what's going on with mining and the role that tribes such as yourself need to play, or are we still talking about collateral damage?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. Good faith consultation means to the tribes is at least being at the table. What happened, what Pegasus and Zortman and Landesky Mining left behind almost happened to Gantier this past year when another mining permit was allowed to another mining company called Blue Arc without consulting Port Belknap, without consulting the tribes, through the state DEQ and the BLM. Never consulted us. The only way the tribes found out about this is we read about it in the newspaper. And then once we found out about it, we filed a lawsuit. And it's just a lack of communication. Like I said in my opening remarks, tribes are our first people of this country. Are second-class citizens to most people. They don't care, they brush us aside. But they seem to forget this was our land first. And we'll fight for it, you know, and we believe everything in our culture is living, including the mountains, the rocks, the grass, everything. And that's how we believe, and that's how we will always believe that. Thank you.
There's a legacy in Indian country of collateral damage and in rural America to a great extent. And that collateral damage, whether you're talking about the situation President Stiffan brought to us today, or the countless other examples of where tribes have been left out of the process, and now we have an issue where we have a contested and controversial decision in front of agencies that really have no power to control any of the other parts of it. I think that's the point of the law. But let me ask Professor Kalin, what are the biggest loopholes in the mining laws that exist that hurt public lands?
I think there's a whole bunch of loopholes, unfortunately. Number one is that it doesn't return any value to the United States because of its claim and location and entry system. Number two, there's not a lot of there's a lack of clarity on how the mining law actually operates today with the use of things like mill sites. So there's actually a need to be able to clarify some aspects of the mining law that are anachronistic. I think another sort of problem is that there needs to be better enforcement. There needs to be better bonding. And then going on to financial assurances, there needs to be better mechanisms for financial assurances. While the Trump administration did decide that there was no need to change the law, change the regulations, it actually flipped what the prior administration had actually said. So initially, they did determine that they needed to have financial assurances, but that was then flipped during the Trump administration. The other thing is we don't have really good abandoned mine reclamation fund operations, so we need to sort of fix that loophole. And finally, as you noted, there needs to be a better mechanism to deal with the selection of what we're going to be doing on the public lands. I think the critical way in terms of facilitating critical minerals is going to be involving everybody through a land planning process. So if you were to use and employ a land management planning process to decide what to do with the lands, involve tribal nations and indigenous people early on, you'd probably avoid a lot of the conflicts later on. You'd probably be able to get a better social license to operate in a community, and you'd probably facilitate, if you will, the ability to mine with much more certainty than the mining industry has today.
Thank you. And Ms. Harold, I'm going to extend my time and return the courtesy to yourself or any member that wishes to for additional time, if that's okay. Thank you. Do you think that updating this 1872 law is going to lead to fewer conflicts between mining companies, local communities, and in the instance, the conflicts that we have around sacred sites and tribes? Do you think updating, reforming this law will lead to less of that? Mr. Kalin?
I think the answer is yes, because if you update it, then what you can do is you can begin to have a planning process that involves the tribal nations, that involves the indigenous communities, that involves, as I said, the local communities. So if the law were updated and actually utilized the land management planning process to make some of these decisions, you'd have earlier efforts to try to figure out how to reach an accommodation by both the industry and all those affected in the local community, including the tribal nations and indigenous people. So I think there's a lot of that opportunity with reform. So thank you.
Thank you. And if I may, Ms. Stru, one question, and I don't think there's any disagreement on any side of the aisle here regarding human rights issues, slavery, child labor. and that we find in other parts of the world, Central Africa, South Africa, parts of Latin America, Peru, Brazil in particular, and parts of Central America, and parts of Asia, and you know, the American people expect the high standards, and we should have the high standards. I don't think that's a fair comparison. But you're right. The issue of human rights and environmental rights is important, and we do a better job. I don't question that. What I do question is that do you feel that if there is a multinational company doing business in Peru with a horrendous track record on human rights violations, do you believe that they should still have access to federal domestic public lands, given their track record of abuse elsewhere and being restrained from that abuse here in the United States by existing law? Do you feel we should prohibit that kind, that they should be banned from doing business on public land based on a human rights record?
Chairman Grijalva, I believe that today's mind frame with the investor pressure for environmental, social, and governance, the ESG initiatives that are forefront of the mind of the investment community really are make that situation hypothetical. For a company to be able to come and operate in the U.S., they have to be able to gain a social license, and they have to be able to demonstrate to the stakeholders, and that's a broad sector of the community, tribal communities, and their shareholders, that they are responsible corporate entities.
Okay, hypothetically, if Rio Tinto, multinational mining corporation, has a couple of problems in Africa, has a couple of problems in Australia in terms of other issues, in Peru or Chile, and they want to do business on public land and have a permit, do we continue to honor that, given that that is a verifiable public record with existing to human rights violations?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you have to view everything in a very site-specific and situation-specific consequence. Again, I believe that companies,
So a track record of human rights violation, worker violations is not sufficient to create a ban?
Again, I don't believe that that would be allowable here. And companies have to be able to earn a social license. And if their track record does not allow them to do that, then I believe the system will respond to that.
Maybe that's thank you. Maybe that's an addition we need to look at specifically within the legislation that we're proposing, because I think down the road that has to be part of the criteria. If we're opening up and deregulating, as many are asking for, and not dealing with reform at the very fundamental level, and not dealing with royalties, and if at $30 million a year, it'll take another 150. We'll be doing the 300th anniversary of the law of 1872 for us to get at the lowball estimate of $50 billion to clean up abandoned and orphaned mines across, particularly the Southwest and other parts of this country. But with that, let me now turn to Mr. Lamborn for his 5 minutes and recognize you, and you have an additional time if you so choose, Mr. Lambert. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to help answer your next to last question. If this law became, it took effect, we would have fewer conflicts because we'd have a lot less mining going on in this country. And with less mining, there'd be less conflicts. Ms. Stru, I'd like to ask you a couple questions about the taxation and royalties. For those who do not understand, what is the difference between a net tax and a gross tax?
Thank you, Congressman. A net tax allows the producer to subtract the cost of making a sellable product, a marketable product, before the royalty is imposed. So, for example, and a gross tax does not allow that at all. There are very few deductions allowable in a gross tax. So, comparing oil and gas again, oil is pretty well marketable as crude oil right as it comes out of the ground from the wellhead. And in contrast, hard rock mining operations like this rock shows, you have to do a lot of work and invest in processing facilities that can cost upwards of $1 billion before you can extract the gold and silver from that rock and have a marketable product. So a net royalty allows you to make deductions for the cost to extract the gold and silver from this rock, and a gross royalty wouldn't. And you'd end up paying on something that's not profits. I mean, we support a royalty that is a fair royalty on our profits, but not on the totality of the investment in the project.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. And also, the people don't have a crystal ball. They don't know what future economic cycles are going to be. Sometimes minerals go in volatile ups and downs. They have volatile swings in their price. And so what might be profitable at one price would be breaking even at a lower price and losing money at an even lower price. And you'll drive them out of business, won't you, if you're taxing on the gross revenues as opposed to the net revenues? Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's an important point. A net royalty allows both the taxpayer and the mineral producer to go to the bank together, which means when mineral prices are high, then the net royalty payments are very high. When mineral prices fall, then obviously the royalty payments aren't as big, but it doesn't put a mine out of business. And so you preserve the jobs, you preserve a revenue stream there. A gross royalty is very insensitive to prices, and it ignores the fact that your costs to get the gold out of this rock are fixed costs, and a gross royalty is very punitive in periods of low mineral prices.
So the way this bill is structured with a royalty on gross revenues in combination with a dirt tax, which I've not really seen before, what would that do to prospective mining operations? Would any even go forward under those onerous, what I consider onerous conditions?
Thank you, Congressman. I think the investment in the U.S. mining industry would decline even more dramatically under the gross royalty and the dirt tax provisions in this bill. It would have a devastating effect, and ultimately will become even more and more reliant on foreign sources for minerals.
So I won't accuse this bill of being intended to drive mining out of business, but I would think it would certainly have that effect, whether it's intended or not. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. This is not the bill. There would never be, in my opinion, the right time for this bill. But this is an especially bad time for this bill when we are staring in the face of a mineral availability crisis.
And then what would happen to the cost of consumer goods like electric vehicles or cell phones or computers if the minerals couldn't be produced in this country and we had to look for foreign sources, especially China?
Oh, I think the cost would inevitably go up because not only would we have to be importing these minerals, it would exacerbate the shortage of minerals that are already that we're already facing, as we heard from Mr. Chen. So availability of the raw materials to build products would be constrained and cause prices to rise.
And what disadvantages do we face when it comes to looking at China as a supplier of raw materials or refined materials, for that matter, that we're not able to produce in this country because of stringent environmental laws or taxation? What does that do to our national security?
Oh, it's very scary what it does to our national security. As Chairman Manchin said on the Senate side 6 weeks ago or so, Russia and China are poised to weaponize critical minerals against us. And we've seen what that's done to Europe. Europe was inappropriately reliant on Russian oil and gas, And we've seen, unfortunately, with the tragedy of the war in Ukraine, what that can do to national security. It's a very alarming situation.
And let me ask you this, because I have just a little bit of time left. Why is the mining claims system beneficial compared to leasing?
It's beneficial because we don't know where hard rock minerals are located. That's very different than the situation for oil and gas, which is a much more abundant resource, and they occur in well understood big sedimentary basins. We have to look very hard. There's a 1 in 1,000 chance of discovering a mineral deposit that can become a mine. And the claim system works beautifully for that because it allows geologists to stay on the land long enough to make that discovery. And I want to make the point that this is a system that has worked well. There's nothing wrong with it. And the BLM already tracks where claims are located. So even though we've got self-initiation and can go where our geologic nose leads us based on our drill hole data, the BLM knows where each claim is located. You have to record a claim with the BLM in order to make it a valid claim, and you have to pay a fee. Initially, each claim costs $225 per claim to establish.
And seeing that I have still a little bit of time to equalize things, I hear references to the mining law of 1872, 150 years old, and it's sometimes, I think, understood by people who are new to the subject that this law is antiquated and anachronous and has never been modified or changed. What are changes that our country has made to mining and environmental laws surrounding mining in the last 150 years that I think seriously and dramatically amend the 1872 law?
You're absolutely right, Congressman. Every single environmental law that applies to other industries applies to the mining industry. And keep in mind that our environmental regulations and laws are relatively new in this country. They started being enacted in the very late 60s, 1970s through the 1980s. Those all apply to mining. And the mining law itself has been amended many times. Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976 was one of the more important amendments to the mining law. And it inserted in the mining law an environmental performance standard. That's the unnecessary or undue degradation standard in section 1732B of FLIPMA, which requires mines to comply with all other environmental protection regulations.
Okay, well, I thank you for setting the record straight on these questions, and I appreciate your testimony, Ms. Strusacker. Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Or I yield to my chairman. Okay, I yield back.
Ranking Member, any closing comments?
I would just say I appreciate the conversation, dialogue we've had today, and I am grateful to have gotten to fill in for my good friend, Congressman Stauber, so thank you for chairing this as well.
Thank you very much. And let me just thank the witnesses and the members of the committee who may have additional questions for our witnesses today, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. And they can submit those within 3 business days, so that following this hearing, and then we'll keep the hearing record open for any contributions to that record for an additional 10 days and await the responses from our witnesses. And I want to thank everybody. I appreciate it. I appreciate President Stiffarm. Thank you very much. You know, the understood and not said was that the 1872, like the Homestead law of that same time, mining law, was also an instrument of dispossession for Native American nations across this country. And we can't forget that, and we can't forget that we need to correct. You can't rewrite that history, you can't erase that history, but you can't correct anything going forward. And the whole intent today is, what do we need to do going forward to correct? And it is a right time to talk about this, where the urgency to make the climate change has created an urgency for us to transition to renewable and clean energy. And that urgency requires critical and essential minerals. We know that. And this law is not about stopping mining, but bringing it into this 21st century reality, number one. Number two, part of that reality is the public's right to know, transparency, and to bear some accountability and responsibility for what comes afterwards. After an operation is done, 20 years, 23 years, whatever that time period is, what happens then? Whose responsibility is to reclaim, restore, or mediate and provide remediation for what's left behind? I think it belongs also with the industry, and it belongs through royalties with the ability to begin to deal with that backlog. And that is not assessing responsibility to a particular company. It's assessing the need to share that responsibility with everybody that's profiting from the extraction of minerals from our public lands. Thank you very much. It's a tough topic, given the times and given the pressure to deregulate, speed up, and ignore the collateral damage of the past. Hopefully, and it's my intent not to ignore that collateral damage and not to seek retribution, but to seek a path forward that is going to take us into this, make us a full part of this next century. Thank you very much. With that, meeting is adjourned.
Mr. Chair, can I make one quick comment? I'd just like to add, this law was made in 1872, a lot prior to a lot of our Native American treaties that put us on reservations, that took all our land. So what I'm saying is, when the tribes got put on reservations and had to sign treaties with the federal government, we had to change as life changed. But this mining law has not changed since 1872. That's all we're asking is update and change and protect our people and our land. Thank you.